Marcus kept checking the clock, getting annoyed. She was too slow, so he let her go. But later, when everything started slipping, that's when he realized he removed the wrong thing. The kitchen at the Gilded Willow didn't smell like food. It smelled like bleach and ambition. Marcus stood on the mezzanine, watching everything like it was supposed to obey him. He liked straight lines, predictable movement. Below him, Hannah moved differently, slower, pausing between the salt and the stir. And this is where people make the mistake. They assume anything that doesn't match their rhythm is a problem. Marcus saw a glitch in the system. Amara, standing in the shadows, saw something else entirely. A woman carrying more than just her shift. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just stood there, his shadow stretching across the polished stainless steel, and pointed a single manicured finger at the digital clock on the wall. Hannah had been sitting for exactly 3 minutes. It was a small thing, really. A woman needing to catch her breath while carrying the weight of a new life. But in a room governed by seconds, a pause looks like a strike. Amara watched from the prep station, her hands stilled over a crate of leeks. She saw it happen, that tiny, devastating flicker in Hannah's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a subtle shift where pride simply drains out, replaced by a cold, sharp fear. That's the thing about people in charge. They often think they're measuring productivity, but they're usually just measuring their own isolation. "The sauce is reducing, Hannah," Marcus said. His tone was as flat as a tabletop. No heat, no edge, just the sound of a man who sees a person as a gear that has suddenly stopped turning. Hannah stood up quickly, too quickly. She stumbled just a fraction, her hand reaching out to steady herself against the heat of the range. Most people don't notice this, but the moment you make someone feel small, you lose the very thing that makes them good at what they do. You get their hands, sure, but you lose their heart. And in a kitchen, you can taste the difference. Amara felt the air in the kitchen change. It grew thin, brittle. The usual rhythmic clinking of pans seemed to stutter. Something felt off, like a song that had suddenly lost its bass line. "I'm sorry," Hannah whispered. She didn't look up, she just grabbed the whisk. Marcus stayed there for a beat longer than necessary. He wanted to make sure the silence felt heavy. He thought he was maintaining discipline, but he didn't realize that silence is a dangerous thing to weaponize. It has a way of echoing back when you least expect it. He turned on his heel and walked toward the mezzanine, his shoes clicking with a rhythmic, mechanical certainty. He felt in control. He felt like the captain of a perfectly tuned ship. But Amara looked at the other cooks. They weren't looking at their stations anymore. They were looking at the floor, and that's when the energy started to shift. It was a small moment, a quiet one. But he didn't realize it yet. Something had already shifted. The news didn't travel through shouts or slamming doors. It moved like a cold draft under a crack in the wall, chilling everything it touched. By the time the afternoon prep started, the kitchen felt different. Empty, but not because people were missing, it was because the people who were still there had checked out. Most people don't notice this, but when you remove someone who carries the heart of a team, the rest of the group doesn't rebel. They just withdraw. Amara watched the dishwasher, a guy who usually spent his shift making the prep cooks laugh until they couldn't cut onions straight. Today, he was a statue. He scrubbed the same pot for 10 minutes, eyes fixed on the soapy water. That's how people act when they realize that their hard work isn't a shield. It's a realization that hits quietly. If it could happen to her, it can happen to any of them. The clatter of the kitchen, usually a rhythmic song, had turned into a series of jagged, isolated noises. No one was talking. No one was helping. The moment a leader breaks that invisible bond of trust, the mission dies. It stops being about the best food in the city and starts being about surviving the next 8 hours without being noticed. Amara saw Marcus packing the mezzanine, looking down at his staff with a satisfied nod. He saw the silence as discipline. He saw the speed as efficiency. But then she noticed the head chef drop a tray of expensive microgreens. He didn't swear. He didn't even sigh. He just swept them into the bin with a blank face and kept going. And that's where things start to change. When people stop caring about the mistakes, you've already lost. Marcus was looking at his spreadsheets, watching the numbers stay steady, feeling like he was in total control. He was proud of the quiet. But something felt off, deeply off. It was the kind of quiet that happens right before a machine finally grinds to a halt. The energy had shifted from a shared dream to individual survival, and in a place like this, that's a death sentence. Amara looked at the empty station where Hana used to stand and felt a sudden, sharp chill. And he didn't realize it yet, but something had already shifted. The kitchen was a machine tonight. Every plate moved with a cold, mechanical precision that Marcus had always claimed he wanted. No one ran. No one laughed. There was just the steady, rhythmic ticking of the order machine. Click, click, click. Amara watched the sous chef garnish a plate. His hands didn't shake, but they didn't dance either. Most people don't notice this, but when you strip the joy out of a room, you're left with something sterile, something dead. The staff wasn't tasting the sauces for flavor anymore. They were checking them for compliance. They wanted to make sure they didn't give Marcus a reason to point that manicured finger again. That's how people act when they've stopped building a dream and started building a bunker. Every dish went out exactly on time. Technically, it was the best service they'd had in months. But then, Amara saw the head waiter return a nearly full plate of risotto. The customer had said it was fine, but they didn't want any more. That's the moment things start to change. You can follow a recipe to the letter, but you can't force the warmth back in once you've driven it out. The silence in the kitchen wasn't peace. It was a wall. Marcus walked the line, his chest out, a faint smile on his lips. He saw the empty tickets and the clean stations. He thought he had finally achieved perfection. He was looking at the surface, but he was missing the cracks underneath. The moment someone values the clock more than the people holding it, they lose the ability to see the danger. Amara picked up a spoon and tasted the signature soup. It had the right salt, the right acidity, but it felt hollow. It tasted like an obligation. Something felt off, and it wasn't the food. What happened next was a slow, quiet realization that drifted through the room. The staff weren't a team anymore. They were just individuals waiting for the clock to hit 11. The heart of the kitchen had left with Hana, and all that remained was the expensive equipment and the cold, bright lights. Marcus stood at the pass, looking satisfied, believing he had won. But he didn't realize it yet. Something had already shifted. Amara reached into the bin near the prep station. Her fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. She pulled it out. It was Hana's small, hand-painted ceramic tasting spoon. The edge was chipped, a tiny, jagged reminder of a hasty departure. Amara wiped the grime off the porcelain and just looked at it. She remembered seeing Hana use this spoon just last week. One of the new boys had messed up a reduction, his hands shaking as he waited for a reprimand. Hana hadn't reported him. She hadn't yelled. She had simply dipped this spoon into the pot, tasted it, and winked. "A little more butter, honey. You've got the heat right," she had whispered. That's how people act when they care about the person more than the process. Most people don't notice this, but a team isn't built on manuals or meetings. It's built on these tiny, invisible moments of grace. The moment Hana did that, the boy didn't just fix the sauce. He stood taller. He became a better cook because he felt safe enough to be human. But then, Amara looked up at the mezzanine. Marcus was staring at a tablet, his eyes tracking the live feed of the kitchen's output. To Marcus, that ceramic spoon was just a piece of inventory, a stray object that didn't belong in a professional bin. He saw a tool for measurement. Hana, though, she saw a tool for dignity. And that's where things start to change. When you look at a workplace and only see the equipment, you stop seeing the soul. Marcus was so focused on the what that he had completely forgotten the who. He was counting the spoons, but he had no idea who was actually using them to keep his reputation alive. Amara tucked the spoon into her apron pocket. The weight of it felt strangely heavy. Something felt off in the way the lights reflected on the stainless steel tonight. Too bright, too sharp. What happened next wasn't a mistake in the kitchen, but a mistake in the mind. Amara realized that without Hana's distractions, there was no one left to catch the small errors before they became disasters. The boy who had messed up the sauce was watching Amara. He saw the spoon. He saw her face. And he didn't realize it yet, but something had already shifted. Marcus sat in his office, the glow of the dual monitors reflecting off his glasses. The spreadsheets were beautiful, green rows, rising curves. Every metric told him he was a genius. Average prep time was down by nearly 12%. Waste was at an all-time low. According to the data, the kitchen had never been more successful. Most people don't notice this, but numbers have a way of lying by telling the truth. They tell you exactly what is happening, but they never tell you why. He decided to walk the floor. He wanted to feel it, the hum of his perfect machine. He expected to see the staff energized by the new pace, maybe even a look of gratitude for the clarity he'd brought to their lives. That's how people act when they confuse fear with respect. They assume that because things are moving fast, they are moving forward. But as he stepped into the heat of the line, the hum wasn't there. He caught the eye of the lead sauté chef, a man who had been there since day one. The chef looked away instantly. No nod. No yes, chef. Just a quick, sharp refocus on a pan of searing scallops. One by one, as Marcus moved through the stations, the eyes of his staff dropped. The moment a leader walks into a room and everyone looks at the floor, he isn't in control anymore. He's just an intruder. Marcus felt a strange, cold prickle at the back of his neck. Something felt off. He was standing in the middle of his own kitchen, but he felt like he was trespassing. It's a psychological trick our minds play. We think that by tightening our grip, we own the thing more. In reality, the harder you squeeze a handful of sand, the faster it disappears through your fingers. He stopped by the pastry station. "Good work on the soufflés tonight, Leo," he said, trying to inject a bit of warmth into his voice. Leo didn't smile. He didn't even pause. He just kept whisking, his movements stiff and robotic. "Yes, Marcus," he replied, his voice as flat as the stainless steel. And that's where things start to change. Marcus realized that he had achieved exactly what he'd asked for, a staff that followed every rule and hit every mark. But in doing so, he had created an empty castle. He was the king, sure, but he was reigning over ghosts who were only physically present. What happened next was a subtle, terrifying realization. He looked at the empty space where Hana used to stand, the spot that used to be the loudest part of the kitchen. He felt a sudden, sharp urge to check the metrics again, as if the numbers could protect him from the hollow silence of the room. He turned back toward his office, his footsteps echoing a little too loudly. And he didn't realize it yet, but something had already shifted. Amara stood at the pass, watching a line cook overseer a piece of sea bass. Usually, she would have leaned in, whispered a correction, and helped him save the plate. But tonight, she just turned away. She let the coldness grow. That's how people act when they've finally checked out. Most people don't notice this, but the real danger to a team isn't the loud arguments or the big mistakes. It's quiet, the indifference. The moment someone like Amara stops caring about the small details, the invisible glue holding the whole place together starts to dry up and crack. Marcus was packing the mezzanine again. From up there, he looked like a general, but to the people on the floor, he was just a man in a suit, an obstacle to be avoided. Every time his footsteps echoed on the metal stairs, the team tightened up, not with focus, but with a stiff, defensive energy. The moment a leader becomes a source of anxiety rather than a source of support, he loses his authority, even if he keeps his title. And that's where things start to change. Amara looked at the pastry chef. He had forgotten to garnish a dessert, and instead of calling it out, the waiter just took the plate anyway. No one wanted to talk. No one wanted to interact. The distance between Marcus in his mezzanine office and the staff on the floor had become a vast, unbridgeable chasm. It was as if they were living in two different worlds. Marcus was in a world of percentages and timelines. The staff, they were in a world of silence and survival. Something felt off, like the temperature in the kitchen had dropped 10 degrees. Even with the ovens roaring, what happened next wasn't a failure of skill, it was a failure of spirit. Marcus stopped at Amara's station and straightened a stack of side plates. He didn't say a word. He just adjusted them by half an inch. He thought he was showing his eye for detail. But Amara just watched him, her expression blank. She realized that he was completely alone. He had built a fortress of standards, but he had ended up locked inside it by himself. The silence was getting louder. And he didn't realize it yet, but something had already shifted. The kitchen was hovering in a strange, clinical stillness. Marcus walked toward the center of the line, his footsteps sounding like a hammer on an anvil. He stopped by the pass, looking at the row of perfectly plated salads. "Looks like we're beating the clock by 5 minutes, team," he said, trying to force a lightness into his voice that hadn't been there for weeks. "Maybe we should start charging for the extra speed, huh?" He laughed, a short, dry sound. No one joined him. The silence that followed was heavy, thick. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Most people don't notice this, but when you spend all your time demanding people act like machines, you shouldn't be surprised when they stop understanding your jokes. That's how people act when they've finally disconnected. Marcus wiped a stray drop of vinaigrette off the counter, but his hand moved slower than usual. He looked at the faces of his staff, Amara, Leo, the young boy at the prep station. They were all looking at their work, their expressions as blank as unwritten paper. The moment someone realizes they aren't respected, they stop participating in the culture. They just follow the instructions. And that's where things start to change. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. He had always believed that the who was watching would be a corporate inspector or a rival owner. But as he stood in the middle of that silent room, he realized the observer was the soul of the room itself, and it was gone. He hadn't just removed a slow cook when he sent Hannah away. He had removed the permission for anyone else to be human. Something felt off. It was the realization that he was standing in a room full of people, and yet he was completely alone. What happened next was a shift in his own internal gravity. He looked at his mezzanine office, the glass fortress where he spent his days staring at graphs, and it suddenly looked like a cage. He had won his war against the clock. He had his percentages. He had his efficiency. But as he looked at the empty space where the laughter used to be, he saw the real cost. He had the metrics, but he had lost the people. He had created a masterpiece of a kitchen, but there was no one left inside it who cared if it burned down. He tried to meet Amara's eyes, but she was already turning back to her station. And he didn't realize it yet, but something had already shifted. The morning review sat on the desk like a cold, heavy stone. Marcus read the words twice, his breath shallow. The critic had given them 5 stars for the presentation and 5 stars for the technique. But the final paragraph was a serrated blade. It described the food as technically flawless but emotionally vacant, as if it had been cooked by an algorithm instead of a human. That's how people act when they've lost the plot. Most people don't notice this, but you can't hide a hollow heart behind a perfect plate. The moment you prioritize the process over the pulse of the people, the audience feels it. They don't know why, but the magic just stops. Marcus stood up, his knees feeling strangely weak. He walked toward the staff locker room, needing to move, needing to find something that made sense. The hallway was too quiet, too clean. Something felt off in the way the air didn't move. He opened a small locker that hadn't been cleared out yet. Inside, tucked into the corner of the metal shelf, was a black-and-white sonogram. Hannah's name was printed in the top corner. A tiny, curled shape, a future frozen in a grainy image. That's where things start to change. Most people think of consequences as a big, dramatic explosion. But real regret is much quieter. It's the realization that you traded a life for a spreadsheet. Marcus touched the paper, and for the first time, the liability he had evicted looked like a miracle he had been too blind to see. The moment someone realizes they've won the wrong war, the victory turns to ash in their mouth. He looked at that tiny heartbeat on the paper and then out at his pristine, silent kitchen. But then, he heard the service bell ring in the distance. What happened next wasn't a phone call or an apology. It was just a hollow, ringing silence in his own chest. He had achieved the perfection he had demanded, but standing there with that photo in his hand, he realized he was the only one left in the building who was truly empty. He stared at the image until his vision blurred. And he didn't realize it yet, but something had already shifted. Marcus stayed late, long after the last ticket had been cleared and the staff had scrubbed the surfaces to a mirror finish. They didn't linger. No one shared a drink at the end of the shift. No one stayed to swap stories about the night's chaos. They just left. That's how people act when they've lost the feeling of belonging. Most people don't notice this, but the most dangerous employees aren't the ones who argue. They're the ones who do exactly what you say and nothing more. The moment people stop offering those small, unasked-for extras, you know the spirit of the place has already moved out. Marcus sat at the pass, the only light coming from the glowing heat lamps. The kitchen was a machine now. It was silent. It was efficient. And he hated the sound of it. He pulled the small ceramic spoon from his pocket and set it on the stainless steel. It looked pathetic under the harsh LED, a tiny, chipped piece of clay. He had spent his whole career trying to build a world where everything ran on time, and now that he was finally sitting in it, he felt like he was suffocating. The moment a man realizes he's traded his warmth for a set of perfect metrics, the victory starts to feel like a slow, quiet defeat. Something felt off. The air didn't have that smell of butter and garlic anymore. It just smelled like chemicals, like bleach. What happened next was a heavy, internal stillness. He looked at the line of mops, the neatly folded towels, and the empty lockers. He realized he had successfully removed every distraction from his vision. There was no more slowing down, no more leaning, no more whispered conversations. He had his perfect kitchen. But then he looked at the door. He realized that tomorrow they would all come back and do it all over again, perfectly, and it would still feel like a funeral. And that's where things start to change. He sat there in the dark for a long time, his hand hovering over that little spoon, wondering when he had decided that being right was more important than being kind. He didn't want the silence anymore. He wanted the noise. He wanted the mess. But he didn't realize it yet. Something had already shifted. The flour was everywhere in the small bakery across town. It dusted the windows and clung to the curtains, a messy, disorganized contrast to the sterile halls of the hotel. Amara stood by the door, watching Hana move. She was slower now, her belly fuller, but she was laughing as she pulled a tray of sourdough from the oven. The air here smelled like yeast and life. That's how people act when they finally find where they belong. Most people don't notice this, but a person's value isn't found in how fast they run, but in the warmth they leave behind when they stop. Amara saw the way the other bakers leaned toward Hana, sharing jokes and tasting dough. The moment someone is allowed to be human again, their talent doesn't just return. It blooms. But then, Amara thought of Marcus. Back at the hotel, the floors were spotless. The metrics were higher than they had ever been. Marcus still sat in his mezzanine office, watching his screens, reigning over a kingdom of perfect silence. He had everything he had ever asked for. And that's where things start to change. You can buy the best equipment in the world and hire the fastest hands, but you can't buy the feeling of home. Most people think success is a number on a page, but the moment you trade your soul for a clean floor, you realize you've just built a very expensive cage. Marcus was successful, efficient, and completely haunted. Something felt off every time he walked through his kitchen. He would look at the station where Hana used to stand and feel a sudden, sharp hollowness. He had won the war against the clock, but he had lost the heartbeat of the room. What happened next was just life. Hana's bakery became the talk of the neighborhood, not because the bread was perfect, but because the place felt alive. At the hotel, the food remained technically flawless, but the dining room felt like a waiting room. Cold. Still. Amara took a bite of a warm roll Hana handed her. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was the best thing she had tasted in months. She realized then that some losses are so quiet you don't even know you've been defeated until the silence becomes too loud to ignore. Marcus was still watching his clocks, waiting for a warmth that would never come back. But something had already shifted. The story of Marcus and Hannah reveals a profound psychological truth often missed in our drive for perfection. The illusion of control is the quickest way to lose a connection. Marcus fell into the trap of believing that efficiency is the same thing as excellence. He looked at his kitchen and saw gears and levers, failing to realize that the most important parts of his team weren't the hands, but the invisible bonds of empathy and trust. In any environment, there is a hidden pulse, a person who carries the emotional weight of the group. Hannah was that pulse. When Marcus removed her to protect his metrics, he didn't just lose a cook, he deleted the psychological safety of the entire room. This is how the quiet consequence works. It doesn't arrive with a bang or a walkout. It arrives as a slow withdrawal where people stop giving their hearts and start giving only what is required. The lesson here is that you can follow a recipe to the letter and still produce something hollow. True success isn't found in a flawless spreadsheet or a sterile environment. It's found in the messiness of being human, the shared laughter in the heat of a shift, and the grace we show one another when we stumble. Marcus won his battle against the clock, but he lost the soul of his craft. He was left with a perfect machine that no one wanted to be inside, while Hannah found a crowded, flower-dusted room that everyone called home. Ultimately, when you treat people like parts in a machine, you shouldn't be surprised when the warmth finally leaves the room. Success without humanity isn't a victory, it's just a very well-organized loneliness.